Next reading from the Lord's Word is from the 11th chapter of the Gospel of John. And in this story, the Lord has heard that Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, is sick, and has said that he means to go to Bethany, where he lives, to heal him. And then we read, "These things he said, and after that he said to them, 'Our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up.' Then his disciples said, 'Lord, if he sleeps, he will get well.' However, Jesus spoke of his death, but they thought that he was speaking to them about taking rest in sleep. And then Jesus said to them plainly, 'Lazarus is dead, and I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him.' Then Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, 'Let us also go, that we may die with him.' So when Jesus came, he had found that he had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away. And many of the Jews had joined the women around Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him, but Mary was still sitting in the house. Now Martha said to Jesus, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you.' Jesus said to her, 'Your brother will rise again.' Martha said to him, 'I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day.' Jesus said to her, 'I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?' She said to him, 'Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is to come into the world.' And when she had said these things, she went her way and secretly called Mary, her sister, saying, 'The teacher has come and is calling for you.' As soon as she heard that, she rose quickly and came to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the town, but was in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and comforting her, when they saw that Mary rose up quickly and went out, followed her, saying, 'She is going to the tomb to weep there.' Then when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.' Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. And he said, 'Where have you laid him?' They said to him, 'Lord, come and see.' Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, 'See how he loved him.' And some of them said, 'Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying?' Then Jesus, again groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, 'Take away the stone.' Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, 'Lord, by this time there is a stench, for he has been dead 4 days.' Jesus said to her, 'Did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God?' Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead man was lying. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, 'Father, I thank you that you have heard me. And I know that you always hear me. But because of the people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me.' Now when he had said these things, he cried with a loud voice, 'Lazarus, come forth.' And he who had died came out, bound hand and foot with grave cloths, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, 'Loose him and let him go.'" And the final reading today is from the book Divine Providence, from the chapter that's called Laws of Permission. The worshipper of self and worshipper of nature confirms himself against divine providence when he considers that wars are permitted, and in them the slaughter of so many people and the plundering of their wealth. It is not owing to divine providence that wars exist, because they're accompanied by murders, lootings, acts of violence and savagery, and many other heinous evils which are diametrically contrary to Christian charity. But still, they cannot but be permitted, because since the time of the most ancient people's life's love has become such that it wishes to rule over others, and in the end over all others, and to possess the world's riches, and in the end all riches. These two loves cannot be kept bound, since it's according to divine providence that everyone be permitted to act in freedom in accordance with his reason, and because without permissions a person cannot be led by the Lord away from evil, and so be reformed and be saved. For if evils were not permitted to break out, a person would not see them, and therefore would not acknowledge them, and so could not be brought to resist them. It is on this account that evils cannot, by any providence, be prevented. For in that case they would remain shut in, and would, like the diseases called cancer and gangrene, spread and eat away every human spark of life. For from birth a person is like a miniature hell, and between it and heaven there is perpetual dissension. No one can be withdrawn from his hell by the Lord unless the person sees that he is in it and wishes to be led out of it. And this cannot come about without permissions. Amen. The most foundational teachings of the new church is that God is good. God is love itself, which means that his very being is the desire to love and to bless something other than himself. And God is also wisdom itself, which means that he has all power to make his desire a reality. These ideas are foundational, and it can be hard to reconcile them with the obvious reality that evil exists. Terrible things happen, and they happen to good people. If we believe that God is love itself and wisdom itself, then we believe that he has something better in store for people who hurt, and that he's got a plan for getting them there. But sometimes it can be hard to understand how the sad things that we experience and a divine plan for making people happy can possibly exist together. It can be tempting to think that maybe God's not fully in control. But if he's not in control, then how can he be called God? Or it can be tempting to think that maybe there are some people that God doesn't want to be happy. But that's a terrible thought. To put it simply, if God is love and God is in charge, then why does so much evil happen? A teaching that helps to make sense of this is the doctrine of permissions. In the teachings of the new church, we're told that the Lord governs every least thing, and his government is called his divine providence. And we're told that there are degrees of divine providence. The Lord watches over every single thing, but some of what happens on his watch is what he wants, and some of what happens is what he merely permits. In the book Divine Providence, we read, laws of permission are also laws of divine providence. There are no laws of permission per se, or apart from the laws of divine providence. Rather, they're the same laws. When we say, therefore, that God permits, we do not mean that he wills, but that for the sake of the goal, which is salvation, he cannot prevent. Things that the Lord permits are things he does not want. He merely allows them for the sake of a greater good. That greater good is our salvation, and that's a really important idea to hold on to. In everything that the Lord does, his ultimate goal is to save everyone, which means to bring everyone into heaven where they can know eternal joy. His providence doesn't make sense if we forget that that's his goal. Eternal joy, not earthly joy. He never does evil. People do evil, and he either stops it or he doesn't. He never wants evil, but if he's given a choice between something that would hurt somebody's chances of salvation and something else, he permits the lesser evil. And that means that everything bad that we see, no matter how terrible it is, happened because the Lord permitted a lesser evil in order to spare us from something worse. And the reading from Divine Providence used war as an example of this. War is a challenge to a lot of people's faith. And people who don't want to believe point at war as evidence for how there can't possibly be a God. That reading made it really clear that the Lord never wants war. People do terrible things in wartime, things that are diametrically contrary to Christian charity. And of course, if something is contrary to Christian charity, then it's contrary to what he wants. He is love itself. But that reading explained that preventing wars, unbelievable as it may seem, would actually do more harm than permitting them. The explanation for that is really the explanation for why any evil happens. We read that evil loves in people cannot be kept bound, since it's according to divine providence that everyone be permitted to act in freedom in accordance with his reason. And because without permissions a person cannot be led by the Lord away from evil and so be reformed and saved. We cannot be saved if we are not permitted to act in freedom in accordance with our reason. If we are not allowed to make our own choices based on our own sight of right and wrong. It's tempting to think that God could sort of force people to behave decently. But if he took our freedom from us, he would take our entire life from us. If he made even one of our choices for us, he would obliterate us, and there'd be nothing left to save. So he treats our freedom with incredible reverence. And if that freedom is to be real, it must include freedom to make the wrong choice. On top of that, we're told that it's actually better for evils to come to light than for them to remain bound up. We read that if acts of evil were somehow prevented by God, those evils would remain shut in and would, like the diseases called cancer and gangrene, spread and eat away every human spark of life. The unfortunate truth is that there is evil in every human heart. The Lord's desire is to save us, and that means that that evil has to be dealt with. And to be dealt with, it has to be recognized. Doesn't mean it has to be acted on, but it does have to be recognized. We're told that evils cannot be removed unless they appear. Or as it said in the reading, no one can be withdrawn from his hell by the Lord unless the person sees that he is in it and wishes to be led out of it. And this cannot take place without permissions. Sometimes it's better for us to see hell around us and say no than for us to live in contentment with our eyes closed. And that doesn't mean that wars and things like it are good. No evil is good. It means that for the sake of the greatest good and the most precious thing in creation, our souls, the Lord permits us to see and do evil. War and things like that might seem like a tremendous price to pay for spiritual freedom. But in the Lord's eyes, no amount of war could cost more than the loss of a human soul. To think like that takes a huge perspective shift. We don't see the world that way, or we don't feel the world that way. When we see war and disaster and corruption on the news, that feels a lot worse than the idea of a person's soul being lost. But the Lord governs the world according to how He sees it, and isn't it right that He should do so? After all, He's God, and as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are His thoughts higher than our thoughts. We're born natural beings, which means that we're born seeing things in a natural way, and we can't help that. But the natural world is nonetheless just a veil on the face of creation. The Lord invites us to lift up that veil and see the truth. He says, lift up your eyes to the heavens and look to the earth beneath. For the heavens will vanish like smoke, and the earth will grow old like a garment, and the people on it will die in like manner. But my salvation will be forever, and my righteousness will not be abolished. What's real and what's precious and what's worth protecting is not what our natural minds have called real and precious. To see the truth, we have to let the Lord change what we see. That means deferring to His point of view. The wonderful thing is that when we let Him lift up our eyes and show us what's most beautiful, then we also see that those best and most beautiful things are the very things that He has been protecting with the fiercest love all along, and that no evil has ever touched them. The world seems like a much better and safer place when we let the Lord show us what He sees. The death of the body is a particularly powerful example of this. To our natural way of thinking, death is just about the worst thing that can happen. And we often measure the awfulness of awful events according to the number of people who died in those events. But death is not as terrible to the Lord as it is to our natural minds. He certainly doesn't want people to die young or to die of accidents or diseases or crimes. He wills for us to have long and healthy lives. But to our natural minds, death is a termination, a loss of existence. And that's simply not what death is. After the death of the body, our soul lives on forever. And in many cases, our happiness after death is limitlessly greater than anything we knew in this world. The Lord sees death in those terms. And that's why he governs the world the way he does. In the story of Lazarus from the Gospel of John, he teaches that death is not the end. In that story, he actually says to the disciples that he's glad for their sakes that he wasn't there to heal Lazarus, because this way he's able to do a greater miracle. This way he's able to raise Lazarus after he'd been in his tomb for days. This way they may see and believe. But this story about the raising of Lazarus shows us something else that is deeply important to remember when we think about the Lord's permissions. When we hear that the Lord sees things differently than we see things, and that things that are terrible to us aren't necessarily as terrible to him, it's easy to infer from this that what we feel doesn't matter because we're wrong. It's easy to think of the Lord dismissing us, saying, patting us on the back and saying, you'll see it differently someday. That picture isn't true. In the story of Lazarus, Jesus weeps. What was it that grieved him? It wasn't Lazarus' death. He had come to Bethany knowing he would raise Lazarus. He'd already said to Martha in so many words, your brother will rise again. He'd already said, I am the resurrection and the life. He knew that Lazarus would be okay. He wept when Mary, like her sister, said to him, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. He wept to see her and the people with her weeping. He wept for their grief and for their despair. They thought that their brother was gone and that their God had failed them. He wept to see their pain. He knew that in such a short time, Lazarus would come out of the tomb and everything would be okay. From a perspective of logic alone, there wasn't any reason to weep. But though the Lord governs by laws that never change, he is more than just so many laws. He loves his children. And our pain is real to him because it is real to us. He may see that it will all be all right. He may see that the evil he's had to permit hasn't harmed the things that matter most. And he is much too wise to try to make us see what we're not ready to see. Think of a parent whose little daughter was given a flower that she delights in, who comes to her parent on the verge of tears because that flower has started to wilt. What could a loving parent do in that situation? They'd see so many things that they couldn't make the child understand. Yes, the loss of the flower is sad, but there are gardens full of those flowers still growing, and untold millions yet to grow and bloom. And that's how it is with flowers. Each one individually lasts a short time, but still, on the whole, flowers are a good and a joyful and an abundant thing, forever renewed. But to the child, that parent would probably just say, I'm sorry. And maybe say, I can't fix it. And maybe give a hug and maybe say, I'm sure there will be more flowers in your life. The Lord is our Father, and to Him we're like children who just don't understand what He understands. There are sorrows and losses in our lives, and maybe in the grand scheme of things those losses are small, but they're big to us, and that matters. He loves us and He comforts us. And all the while, He sees what we can't always see. That every loss is answered with new gifts. That for every sorrow, there are blessings blooming in hidden places, an untold abundance yet to come. When we grieve for the evil in the world, He comforts us. And gently, He suggests that what we see is not all there is. That in this world, His kingdom, His will shall be done. Most assuredly, I say to you that you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. And you will have sorrow, but your sorrow will be turned into joy. Amen.